Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm the program chair of the Democratic Women's Club of Santa Cruz County. I want to start by apologizing to all of you for our screw up, and I'll say my screw up with the sending the wrong URL out in our press release, which then got duplicated when that was forwarded to a bunch of other people, including some of our panelists. But fortunately, the DWC members are early risers, and we were able to get on this and send the correct URL out to our extensive MailChimp list, as well as to fixing it on our Facebook page and our website and elsewhere. So hopefully not too many people will have missed this because they got sent the wrong URL. I went there. It tells you there's no such URL if you clicked on the old one we sent out in the Sentinel ad, for example. I needed to let everybody know that we are recording this call this morning, as we have with all of our Zoom calls, and it will be the link to it will be posted on our website and our Facebook page. It ends up eventually on YouTube, where we know we have a lot more viewers that actually show up in the morning on Saturday. So those are my announcements. I'll turn this over now to Peggy Flynn, who's going to MC this event. Peggy.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I'm Peggy Flynn, and welcome to another important and wonderful educational Zoom by the Democratic Women's Club of Santa Cruz County. Before we get started with the program, I have three DWC announcements. One is that we have sent a letter to Senator Feinstein in support of S1, also called the People's Act of 2021 on voting interests. And we're going to ask our members to check Dianne Feinstein's site and to call and email as well in support of that bill. Second, the DWC is working to oppose the recall of Governor Newsom, and there'll be more information on our website in the future. We're dwcscc.org. And then the last one is going to ask for people who are members to put on their video, because we're going to ask for a vote of support from the membership of donations that we're about to make. $500 to Close the Gap, $250 to Stone, Laird, and Rivas, and $475 to Panetta. So all the members, if you could put your video and then just raise your hands, and I think Molly and I will count people. So again, it's just members. So if you're in support of us making those donations, please raise your hand by your face and we'll count. And if you put up the electronic one, that's great too. Molly's counting. If somebody's, you got it, Molly?
Yeah, could Deb or could you help me count to make sure we get this right, or anybody else who wants to assist?
And let me also ask if anybody is on the phone who's a member to say your name and yay or nay so we can capture that information as well. I don't seem to have all my fingers there. Okay. I only had 3 fingers.
I think I'm seeing 10.
Okay, Diana, did you get a chance to vote?
I didn't hear what the issue was. I just logged on.
All right, my dear, no problem. It's for the donations we're making.
Oh, yeah.
500. There you go, because you read the email. All right, are we okay?
Then ask for the opponents if there are any.
All right, and thank you. Any opponents? Get those hands down. All righty, good to go?
Yep.
All righty, well, thank you everybody for coming this morning. You all may know this, but the DWC is an independent chartered club of the Democratic Party. Our mission is to empower by increasing knowledge and participation in the party. We do this through current issues like our forum today on the recall, monthly newsletters, networking opportunities, and supporting the election of Democratic candidates. Membership is open to registered Democrats of all gender affiliations who live in Santa Cruz County. And you can, again, get more information by looking at our website, dwcscc.org. All righty, so now we'll get going on the real program. So it's on recall today, the recall elections, history and logistics and background on the upcoming election attempt to recall Governor Newsom. Our speakers today are first, Tricia Weber. Tricia joined the Santa Cruz County Elections Office in 1998 and has assisted in many of the divisions, clerk services, election offices, vote by mail, canvass management, and she was the assistant county clerk from 2013 until her appointment as county clerk registrar of voters in December of 2020. So congratulations again, Tricia. Tricia graduated from CSU Fresno with a BS in International Business And she's also was a teacher, her teaching credential from Chapman University, and she taught both kindergarten and special election. Outside of
Special
work,
ed.
she enjoys
Special ed.
special ed. What did I say? Whatever. Okay, special ed. We're happy to have Trish here this morning. And our other speakers are Gary South, called the Carville of California, but he'll be introduced by Phil Trounstein of CalBuzz, who will first make his own brief remarks on the recall and then introduce Gary. And then ending our discussion today is Molly Regan, a board member of the Democratic Women's Club, who will share some resources and how people can get involved on fighting the recall. So unless there's anything pertinent that I missed, we're going to go right to Tricia. Take it away. Oh, also, Mike had asked everybody to keep yourselves muted. And if you do speak, then remember to mute yourself afterwards. And yeah, we're going to do all the Q&A at the end. You can put questions in the chat as we're going along, and Molly's going to be paying attention to that. All righty, Tricia, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for having me here this morning. It's nice to see so many faces and names of people I haven't been able to see in quite some time. So hi, good to see you again. I was asked to talk about the recall process and its, as a whole. I will tell you that since 1913, the state of California has seen 55 attempts to recall governors. However, only one made it to ballot, and that one who made it to ballot was the successful recall of Gray Davis in 2003. I say only one has made it to ballot so far because technically Newsom's has not made it to ballot. It's still in the process of being deemed sufficient. So it sounds a little weird to say that there's only one that's gone to ballot so far, but that's the reason why. And this will be the 6th attempt at a recall for Gavin Newsom. Just so you know, of all of the recalls attempts since 1913, there have only been actually 6 successful ones in the state of California. There were 3 for Senate, 1913, 1914, and 2018, 2 for assembly members in 1994 and 95, and then of course the governor one in 2003. So why is it so difficult to get there? Well, it's a pretty long process. First, there's a notice of intent that has to be signed by 65 voters. It has 200 words on there. And of course, for all of you who have ever submitted any documents like candidate statements or anything to the elections department, 200 words really doesn't equal 200 words because we have our own unique way of counting things. But there's a 200-word grounds for the recall. It gets published, and if the 65 voters who signed it are indeed registered where they say they are, then it goes into the petition creation and approval phase. The Secretary of State's who does that on a state recall. And once they approve it, then they have the proponents have 160 days to circulate the petition to get 12% of voters that cast votes in the previous election for that state office. So for the governor, the magic number was 1,495,709. And that 160 days was originally supposed to be done on November 17th of last year. However, the proponents petitioned the courts in order to get an extension, stating that it was very difficult for them to circulate a petition during the stay-at-home and other conditions that were happening during the summer and fall, of last year. So the court agreed, and they extended their signature gathering phase to March 17th of this year. So on March 17th, the counties received in their last phase of petitions. The difference with the statewide one is it rolls in. So there's some that can be put in here on this date and some on this date and some on this date. And then the counties check them and turn in their numbers. So there's like an ongoing number, like a rolling counter. That's different from a local recall. A local recall is if it's due on the 17th of March, all of the sections come in on the 17th of March. So, so on the 17th of March, we got in our last round and we did our numbers and we turned them into the Secretary of State's office. And we had already been ordered to do a 100% validation, which means that there were the sampling. For you statistical people, they make this big, huge palabra, and then they say, if you do a statistical sampling, if it falls in here, then we do 100%. If it falls over here, it will never qualify. If it falls over here, means there's more than enough in that statistical sampling that you don't have to go on. So we were in this middle doing the 100% sampling, and we turned in our numbers on the 22nd of April. Just so you know, when we turn in our numbers, we pass our signatures 3 times. First, we do an initial pass. Then a second person comes in and does, they look at one good signature that was deemed good on the first pass to verify that it really was indeed good. And then they also look at all of the challenge signatures, and a signature could be challenged for various reasons, such as the address that they listed was not the address that they were registered at the time the petition was signed. The signature doesn't match. They didn't properly fill out the date, the address portion. It was not done in their own hand, or the circulator didn't fill out their declaration, various reasons. So we go back and we look at those again. And then we did a third pass to ensure that the challenge signatures were really challenged. Now, this was not something that we instituted in this office just because it was this recall. This is what we do on a normal basis when we are doing signature verification of any signatures. It's always multiple people looking at them to determine that they're good or challenged. And so once the counties turn in their numbers, and then the Secretary of State says there's a sufficient enough amount of signatures that this petition appears to be good. So they instituted what was known as the supplemental withdrawal period. So this was any voter who had signed the petition that wanted to withdraw their name from the petition. They had 45 business days to contact their election official and ask that their signature be withdrawn. At the end of that 45 days, which was June 8th, the counties have until the 22nd of June to resubmit their numbers. So when we resubmit our numbers, we say, this is how many withdrawals we had during the withdrawal period, and this is now the number of good signatures that we have. Once the counties turn in their numbers, and all 58 counties have been given their new numbers to the Secretary of State, then the Secretary of State will ask the Department of Finance to do an estimate on how much the election will cost across the state. And then after the estimate is posted, the JLBC, the Joint Legislative Budget Committees, will review the estimate and make the appropriation. That estimate needs to be posted for 30 days before that, so it can be reviewed. And then as soon as that 30 days expires, if the Secretary of State goes to the Lieutenant Governor and says there are enough signatures for this petition to be sufficient, at that time, the Lieutenant Governor calls the election, and that election will be held between 60 and 80 days from that date. So the number one question that I get right now is, when's the recall election? And I go, your guess is as good as mine. I can tell you when I think it's going to be, but I don't know for sure, because the Secretary of State deemed sufficient numbers before our final report. So they triggered the supplemental period earlier. So it kind of, so each thing can be, each little time frame can be waived or not waived, can be shortened in a way based on when they do it, with the exception of the 30-day posting for review of the JLBC. That one is a set in code, must be 30 days. But we can get back to that one in a minute. Once the election is called, then the candidate filing period will open. Candidate filing must be completed by E-59, means 59 days before the election. So if the election is called 60 days, there is a single day for candidate filing. If it's called from the date is more than 60 days, then of course the candidate filing fee or candidate filing time frame is a little bit longer, but it must end on the 59th day before the election. We will receive our certified list on the 55th day before the election. That gives us 10 days to create ballots to get them out to our UOCAVA voters, which are our military and overseas voters. That's a federal deadline. We have to have those out by the 45th day before the election. And then the rest of our ballots will go out to voters on the 29th or around the 29th day before the election. We will be sending ballots to all registered voters in the county of Santa Cruz, like we did in November 2020. There was a bill passed earlier in the year with urgency legislation asking counties to do that for any election that was held or proclaimed in 2021. As far as how the election will look in Santa Cruz, it's a little bit hard to tell. Right now, it says in code that we must conduct the election as it was if it was a regular election. So if we were having, like in June, when the governor's office is up in the primary election, we would have traditional polling places. Santa Cruz County has around 140 of those. However, starting in 2020, we started migrating towards the vote center model. And in March, we had 10 voter service centers. And in November, we took advantage of a change in code allowing counties to do that. And we had 20, which included our vote mobile. And those were open Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and election day for voting. Because Santa Cruz has not completed their transition to vote centers, the recall election will most likely be held again with traditional polling places, with vote centers open on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Right now, we hear that there is, we know that there's a trailer bill that is attached to the budget. And in that, it is making certain that counties understand that it's being conducted as a regular election, that special election rules don't matter. Just to say what a special election rule is that we are allowed to super consolidate. So that means counties with traditional polling places can do one polling place for 6,000 voters instead of one polling place for 1,000. And for counties that are in the that do Voters Choice Act, that means that they can do one vote center for 30,000 as opposed to one vote center for 10,000. So as far as resources in a short compressed time, that's why those super consolidation rules exist for special elections, because when you have an election that's called less than 88 days in advance, we need the flexibility in order to go out and find those locations and make it a good voting experience. We also know that in that trailer bill, it's waiving the JLBC's 30-day period to review. They've already reviewed the preliminary estimate that was put forth by the Department of Finance. They've already allocated $215 million and some change for reimbursement to the counties. So that bill is saying that if the Department of Finance has done their posting and the money is already allocated, then that 30 days is not needed. So if that 30 days goes away, then the next step is, after the Department of Finance has done their final posting, is that the Secretary of State says, okay, we're sufficient, and they call the election. So that's why we started off this whole entire process back at the beginning of the year, when we were watching the petitions come in and it looked like it was going to be, enough signatures to be sufficient. Doing the calendar, thinking we're looking at a late November election, but then we've watched the time frame get shorter and shorter. And now we're looking at the possibility of an election maybe as early as the end of August, but most likely in the month of September. I believe that was my section. I talked less than 10 minutes. Did you want me to talk more? Because I can always talk.
Well, we'll leave it open for questions.
Okay.
Yeah, Tricia, thank you so much. I have one thought, and you might want to put your website in the chat, because, not only for additional information, but a lot of our members are regular volunteers at elections, so that would be helpful. But thank you. That was really good information on the logistics and process. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I am not able to access the chat. It says it's disabled for me. So I'll
Yeah.
write it on a piece of paper and hold it up.
Okay, and we will add it to our website, and we will add it to the recording. So thank you.
Mhm.
All right. So we're going to go. Thank you, Phil Traunstein, for being with us this morning. Both you and Gary, it's really a pleasure to have you join us. And Phil, I know you're going to do more than introduce Gary. You've got 10 minutes of your own time to make remarks on the recall. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy, and thanks, Tricia. I probably won't take the full 10 minutes, but let me say a few things in terms of general context, and I'll tell you a little bit about Gary. I think it's important. First of all, I understand this is a very sophisticated audience, and so I hope I'm not speaking way below your level of knowledge, but let me run through a few things. And if it's so obvious, just interrupt me and tell me that you don't need this. But I think it's important when we look at the current state of affairs and the recall, to understand what's happened to party registration in California over the last 20 years, say. And in very broad terms, basically what's happened is Democrats have stayed about the same in terms of their proportion of the electorate in California. They've been between 43 and 46% fairly consistently over a period of 20 years. The big change is that the Republican Party has dropped from around an average of around 35% down to 25, 24%. And the decline to states have gone up about 10%. So the Democrats have stayed the same. Republicans have dropped 10%. Decline to states have gone up 10%. That's the general sort of broad brush and broad strokes. So when you hear today that 78% of Republicans are in favor of recall, that's 78% of a lot smaller group of people than ever before that we're looking at. And so, yes, 78% of Republicans want to recall the governor, but 78% of the Republicans would want to do anything that the Republican Party said. And 47% of independents are in favor of recall, and 11% of Democrats. And so basically what you've got is this huge body of people that are not in favor of recall. And that's the number one question. The first question is, should there be a recall? If recall fails, as you know, then there is no second step and it doesn't matter. But let's just assume for a second that there was a second step and take a look at the field that we know that's out there right now. John Cox got 38% of the vote against Gavin Newsom. I think that's John Cox's high watermark and maybe higher than he'd ever get again.
Explain who John Cox is.
He's a Republican who ran for governor Uh, Gary can tell you more about him. He basically is sort of a rootless Republican. Never really had any base of operation, but he has enough money to keep himself in play. He got 38% against Newsom, 62%. Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego, is out there, but Kevin Faulconer has never run with an R behind his name. He's only run as a nonpartisan a mayor of San Diego. He's never been out there as a Republican. And the first thing he did when he practically the first thing he did was he went over to Devin Nunes' district and talked about how he was basically put himself in the Trump camp. And the only other name of note is Caitlyn Jenner, and Caitlyn Jenner is really just catnip for the news media and the latest shiny object. Uh, she's not a serious entity in California politics in any way. So there's nobody in the field that represents anything like what Arnold Schwarzenegger did in 2003. But even before you get to that point, the fact is, if you got 40% of the people for recall and 57% say no, you got 90% who are telling pollsters the worst of the economic problems we face behind us. You got a 54 to 56% approval rating for Governor Gavin Newsom and a 64% approval of his handling of the pandemic. We're at about 70% vaccinations. Fundamentally, the recall has offered no rationale, really no rationale. We have economic recovery that's doing fairly well, and we've got COVID in pretty good shape. The schools is a problem for for Newsom, but I think the schools are a problem for any governor, particularly when you consider that really it's local school districts that make the decision, not the governor of California makes the decision about when schools are open and under what conditions. So the conditions for recall that exist are very favorable for Newsom. CalBuzz wrote a piece last month saying that Newsom that the recall will fail and Newsom will come out of this stronger than he was in the past by looking at the Feinstein model in San Francisco in 1983, where Clint Riley, who was a campaign manager, used the recall basically as a stepping stone to get Feinstein reelected the following year. I don't have too much more to say. Gary can be much more eloquent about this, and let me just tell you a little bit about him before I introduce him.
Be careful.
Gary,
now.
you need to understand, is a native of Montana. This is very important because he's a University of Montana graduate, president of the student body. He's a nerd from Montana. He's not a cowboy from Montana. He's a nerd from Montana. Very few people know this about Gary, but he is an expert at liturgical vestment design. He has a sidelight that he does, and he's one of the most famous political consultants in America. He's up there with Rove and Carville and Atwater, and yet he's got this side interest in designing liturgical vestments. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. I first got to know Gary, I think it was about 1998, maybe before that, maybe 96. 97. And we've known each other and actually as reporter and source, I think trusted one another as reporter and source when I was at the political editor at the Mercury News. And I covered Gray Davis's election in 98, and Gary was running that election. But Gary, he's had so many different backgrounds. He worked for the federal and state governments in 3 different states, including special assistant to the U.S. Cabinet Secretary, senior political advisor to the governor, communications director for another governor, chief of staff to lieutenant governor, PIO, director of the state legislature. He's managed and played a leading role in myriad campaigns from city council to president. In 2016, he was the lead strategist for Proposition 61 for drug price relief. Gary is one of the people that reporters talk to, whether you quote him or not, just because he helps reporters figure out the lay of the land. He's smart enough and objective enough to be able to help a reporter figure out what's real and what's not real, what's worth paying attention to, what's not worth paying attention to. And he's a brilliant political strategist, I have to say, and a decent human being. His son James is one of the maybe the pride of his life, he's an old friend of mine, and it's a pleasure to introduce Gary. Take it away, Gary.
Thank you, Phil. Your check's in the mail. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm going to sort of give you the same conversation I've had with numerous reporters on this recall that's upcoming. I was involved in the 2003 recall. I was Governor Davis's chief political advisor. I ran his campaigns for lieutenant governor in 94, governor in 98, and re-election in 2002. And was heavily involved in every aspect of the recall, although I wasn't actually a paid consultant. I did it just because I wanted to beat the recall. But one of the temptations that reporters have had, and particularly national reporters, is to try to equate what happened in 2003 with what is going to happen in 2021. And you know, there's the 2003 recall is the only precedent we've ever had, because as has been pointed out, even though we've had dozens of recall attempts against sitting governors, only one ever made the ballot, and that was the one in 2003. So what I'd like to do today is to sort of lay out for you the reasons, based upon my own experience in 2003, the reasons that this recall does not equate to the one in 2003 at all. And let me tick off the reasons. First, and Phil pointed this out, California is just a hell of a lot more democratic today than it was in 2003. I mean, even though Al Gore carried California in 2000 by 11 points, even though in 2002, we carried all statewide constitutional offices, Democrats did, for the first time since 1882, if you can believe that. So everyone clear back in that period of time thought, oh, it's a deep blue state, it's royal blue. And it was trending a lot more democratic, but not nearly as much as it is today. Phil pointed out these statistics, but in 2003, Democrats had only an 8.4% registration advantage over Republicans in California. Today, it's 22.1. The Democratic registration age is almost 3 times what it was in 2003. Number two, you know, a governor coming into a recall, you know, whether it's whether it's Gray Davis in 2003 or Scott Walker in Wisconsin in 2012 or Gavin Newsom here in 2021, you have to look at their last victory. As it's not determinative, but Newsom won a far stronger victory in 2018 than Davis did in 02. Even though we spent a massive amount of money in 02, Davis's numbers were already pretty much in the tank, and we pulled out a 47 to 42 point victory, a 5-point victory over basically an empty suit, Bill Simon. Newsom, however, in 2008 won 62 to 38. Now put that in historical perspective. That is the largest margin of victory for any governor of California, Democrat or Republican, since 1950, before I was born. And it is the largest margin of victory for a non-incumbent governor since 1930 in California. And so, you know, you can't rest on your laurels, but he comes into this in a far stronger position electorally than Davis did going into 2003 with a relatively weak re-election victory in 2002. Three, and Phil mentioned this as well, but even though Newsom's approval ratings have deflated somewhat, over the course of the last year, they're still relatively strong. The last, PPIC poll had 54% job approval and 64% approval of his handling of the pandemic itself. And so he is nowhere near the Nixon level disapproval ratings that Davis was receiving in 2003. In August of 2003, just before the October recall, which was on October 7th of 2003, the field poll, God rest its soul because it's now defunct, but the field poll came out with a poll showing Davis's approval rating at 22%, 22%. I mean, that's Nixon territory just before Nixon resigned. And Field at the time said that was the lowest job approval rating they had ever polled for any governor of California, Democrat or Republican, in their 50-year history up to that point. So Davis goes into the recall less than 2 months before that recall with a 22% job approval rating and 70% disapproval rating. I mean, Phil's been around politics a long time, and I'm telling you, trying to save somebody who's got a 22 to 70 job disapproval rating is pretty difficult.
Let me just interrupt. Let me just interrupt 1 second, Gary, and say he was at 62% when I left the governor's office.
Right. Everything went downhill when you left.
Yeah, right.
But fourth, in this particular recall, and Phil referenced this as well, I mean, there really is no obvious larger than life figure like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and there's not going to be. And I've written about this in various opinion pieces. When Arnold got into that race in the summer of 2003, it changed the dynamic of the whole recall election, in that he was such a strong and powerful personality type. He had 100% name ID in California. He didn't have to introduce himself to California voters. And he became really the public face of that recall. And we were talking about this before everyone got on the line, but that did ultimately come down to a Davis versus Schwarzenegger race, even though the way we structure recalls, they're not running against each other. And in fact, we got a lot of pressure from media outlets in 2003 to have a one-on-one debate between Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I said, no, they're not running against each other. Davis is on his own line running against himself on a yes or no vote on the recall, and Arnold is running against 134 clowns, right? If you want to have a debate, have Arnold debate the 134 clowns. So we refused to do it. But nonetheless, once Arnold got into it, he became the public face of the recall, and the strength of his candidacy really knocked several other potentially strong candidates out of the race, including former Mayor Dick Reardon, who was going to run, Congressman Darrell Issa, who actually put up the $2 million to fund the recall signature gathering effort and wanted to run and be governor himself, and Peter Uberoth, who had gotten in, got out. So he changed the dynamic in terms of becoming the public face of the recall and knocking other potential viable candidates out of the race. Fifth, the chances are nil in this election, in this recall election, that Newsom's own Democratic lieutenant governor is going to renege on his pledge and engage in the treachery of actually running to replace him. Now, I want to talk about this for a second because it's important for Democrats to understand this. We've seen this movie before. In 2003, Cruz Bustamante, the sitting lieutenant governor, made a public pledge, as did all other 6 Democratic statewide elected officials, that they were not going to run in the recall. And our polling and our modeling told us that having a viable, high-profile Democrat in that replacement line was going to complicate our ability to beat the recall on the first line. But he decided to put his own political future ahead of saving the incumbent governor of California and got involved in the recall. Now, why was that problematic? Well, let me explain it to you, because I've seen people like Christine Pelosi, bless her heart, out there talking publicly about how, oh no, we got to have a Democrat in there. We got to have a Democrat on the replacement line. Willie Brown, who should know better, saying the same thing. Oh, no, it's absolutely imperative that we have a Democrat on that replacement line. Here's why you don't want that. First of all, we tried, just like Newsom is doing, to make this a Republican recall. It's a Republican power grab. They couldn't beat him in 2002, so now they're coming back for a redo, right? But the problem we found in focus groups was that people who were not really into the nuances of how these recalls work would say, well, how can it be a Republican recall when his own Democratic lieutenant governor is running against him? And then you had to go back, well, he's not really, he's in the replacement line. That's a different thing. You know, it was just highly, highly complicated to try to explain to people why Bustamante was not really running against Gray Davis, running against his own governor. The second complication from a messaging and strategy standpoint is that we found, to our chagrin in focus groups, that there was a meaningful number of Democrats who basically had voted for Davis in 2002, but didn't particularly care for him, who thought they could vote to recall him in that first line and then vote for Bustamante and have a 2-for-1 sale. You could get rid of Gray Davis, who you didn't like in the first place, and then you could just replace him with a Democratic lieutenant governor, and you know, nobody would know the difference. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, did it? Bustamante got about 31% of the vote. He got slaughtered by Schwarzenegger. And so having a high-profile, viable Democrat on that replacement line, and Newsom understands this, by the way, because he and I have talked about this extensively, why you don't want a Democrat, and which is why now there is a lot of pressure among Democratic elected officials and the state Democratic Party to keep Democrats out of that replacement line. He understands the experience we had in 2003 with Bustamante. And so Democrats who voted to recall Gray Davis in that first ballot line in 2003 and then voted for Cruz Bustamante, it wasn't a 2-for-1 sale, it was a double loss, because we lost a Democratic governor replaced by a Republican, and he was not replaced by the highest profile Democrat running against him. So you don't want that to happen. One other difference that I will tell you too between the 2003 and 2021 recall is that, remember, again, Davis had just been reelected in 2002, even though it was kind of an anemic reelection victory. So one of the arguments we tried to use in our modeling, both in focus groups and in polling, was to say, well, wait a minute, they had a chance to beat him in 2002 and they couldn't do it, right? So now they're coming back for a redo. They're coming back for a make good, right? That's not fair. If they wanted to beat him, they should have beat him in 2002. We thought that was a pretty good argument, but unfortunately what we found in focus groups was even some Democrats saying, well, yeah, I voted for him for re-election in 2002 because he was running against a nincompoop, but I still didn't like him and I held my nose when I did it. But now if we don't recall him, we're going to be stuck with a guy for 4 years. The only way to get rid of him is recalling him because he can't run for re-election. He's term limited out. Newsom's situation is turned on its head. Newsom is in his first term, not in his second term, and Newsom is up for re-election in 2022, just next year. And so the ability to use that, why are they trying to do a recall when they have a general election? We couldn't use it in 2002 because it just didn't sell for the reason that I just stated. But Newsom has the ability, and I think is making it quite well. Look, I'm up for re-election in 2022, just next year. You want to kick me out of office? Then do it then. Do it in 2022. Don't engage in a $400 million special recall election just the year before I'm on the ballot to try to kick me out of office prematurely. So there are a lot of differences in terms of Davis's standing in 2003 and Newsom's in 2021. And one of the most powerful is when Davis was reelected in 2002, just about a week after the election, he got notice from his Department of Finance that he was going to be facing a $35 billion budget deficit in the next fiscal year. And by the way, that creeped up to $38 billion by the time we got into 2003. Newsom has an unprecedented $80 billion budget surplus, not a budget deficit. And if you follow the news lately, I mean, Newsom is Newsom is throwing that money out like a clown in a parade, throwing out the saltwater taffy to the kids on both sides of the street. So the economic situation that we're in, we had just gone through the dot-com bust in 2003. The economy was down, budget deficit huge, and Davis really couldn't do anything, at least anything much, to solve that problem between the time the budget deficit was known and the time that the recall was scheduled on October 7th. So completely different dynamic in 2003 than in 2021. Now, having said all of that, we still have to work our tails off to make sure we beat this thing, and not just beat it, but beat it badly. Because think about this, folks. There have been 55 attempts to recall California governors. Only 2 of them will have made the ballot. And what that means is 2 of the last 3 Democratic governors have been subjected to recall. 2 of the last 3 Democratic governors have been subjected to recall because Republicans understand they can't win the governorship outright. They haven't won it since Arnold Schwarzenegger, won it in the recall in 2003. And by the way, the last time the Republicans in California beat a sitting Democratic governor, except for the recall in 2003? 1966, when I was a sophomore in high school, Pat Brown. They have shown over decades their inability to win governor's races outright. And so they can't get in through the front door of the governor's office. They have decided to use the recall to try to get in through the back door of the governor's office. And we have to put a stop to this nonsense. And by the way, I've told my Democratic friends who are arguing, well, we didn't need a Democratic replacement candidate. What if something happens? And what if he gets recalled? I mean, the fact is that the mode the Republicans are in California in terms of their complete electoral impotence, it wouldn't matter if Newsom was recalled and a Democrat replaced him, because they'd start recall proceedings against whoever that replacement candidate was. We have to nip this bullshit in the bud, and now is the time to do it. Don't just beat it barely. Don't just beat it 50% plus 1, but beat it badly. Beat it 56, 58, 59, 60%. And that will do 2 things. Number one, it will discourage future attempts to try to harass a Democratic governor with a recall attempt, which is really all this is. And number 2, it kind of cuts off the funding sources for these recalls. I mean, if this thing goes down in flames versus just barely, people who gave money to the recall, who funded the recall, who funded the signature collection for the recall, will be a lot less prone next time to give money. And you got to have money to do this. You can't just do this with an all volunteer effort. It's too big of a state, and the signature requirement is far too high. So that's kind of my take on it. I mean, I think we're in good shape. I think we do beat it. I don't think it matters what candidates run, because they're not going to be governor anyway. It doesn't matter who gets how many votes on that replacement line. I think we beat it, but we have to beat it badly, and we Democrats have to mobilize here. Now, one other thing I will say to you. There's been concern that a recall election in a non-election year on a funny date where people are not used to voting will have a low turnout possibility. But that's not what happened in 2003. In the general election of 2002, only 7.7 million voters voted in the governor's race. This was a regularly scheduled general election in November when people are used to voting. In the recall election on October 7th in 2003, and off year, not supposed to be an election on October 3, 9.9 million voters voted. 2 million more voters voted in the recall in 2003 than voted in the regularly scheduled general election for governor in 2002. So it is not necessarily the case, based upon the one example we have, the one precedent we have, that a recall election during an off year on an odd date that people aren't used to voting on is going to draw a very low turnout, which obviously would be bad for Democrats. But we have to make sure that we have maximum turnout and that we beat this thing into the ground with a wooden mallet when this thing is scheduled. not just basically beat it barely. We want to put a stop to this nonsense once and for all. And I think that beating this thing overwhelmingly is going to be a disincentive for the Republicans to continue to try to take this tack of not being able to beat us in regularly scheduled general elections, but then coming back and trying to get in the back door by scheduling recalls, which are basically now just a harassment maneuver against Democratic governors.
Let me add one thing about context that Gary just neither of us had mentioned, and that is that there's a huge difference between a governor whose biggest challenge is a pandemic that is worldwide and an energy crisis that's created by Enron, Williams, and funded by Darrell Issa and others in an attempt to make it look as if the governor is responsible for that energy crisis. So the sort of the global context of the challenge facing the governor is completely different today than it was in 2003. Davis was blamed for blackouts and brownouts that were truly not his own fault. You can't blame Gavin Newsom for the pandemic.
And in addition, I mean, using the pandemic as an excuse for the recall, which is what the recall proponents are now doing, doesn't square with the petition they filed back in February to launch the recall, because in that petition, there was no mention of the pandemic. There was no mention of COVID-19. There was no mention of anything having to do with public health. It was all just a basic laundry list of the typical right-wing Republican complaints. Taxes are too high, too much regulation, businesses are fleeing California, gun control, blah, 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 blah. So they've now tried to repurpose the purpose of the recall after the fact to claim, oh, it's all about his handling of the pandemic. Well, that's not what you said when you launched the recall. This is just basically, I mean, look, don't believe anything that the recall proponents tell you about why the recall is necessary, why we should recall Gavin Newsom. This is about nothing more than just they can't win the governor's office straight out in a regularly scheduled general election. And so they're trying to come in through the back door. And if we don't stomp this thing into the ground, they're going to keep doing it. They're going to keep doing it against every subsequent Democratic governor. I guarantee you, we have to beat this thing into the ground. So that's kind of my 2 cents. And most of that was true.
Thank you, Gary. You know, we're doing well on time. I wanted to ask Phil and Tricia if there was anything that they wanted to chip in again for quickly before we check questions in the chat. Phil?
I don't think so.
Okay, Tricia?
I wanted to say that I changed my name to my website.
Okay.
So, just so you can see that there. And I think that was it.
Oh, that's very clever. Thank you. That's better than your piece of paper you're
Well,
going to
yeah,
hold up.
I
Super.
have that, but it's backwards. So.
There you go, right. Votescount.us. Super,
Yep.
super. And we'll include it in our recording. So I'm going to switch over to my colleague, Molly Regan, to talk about the questions that are in the chat. And when we go through those, if there's still time and a question comes up, just raise your hand. But let's do the chat first. Molly?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Fair enough.
Chat is disabled for everybody.
Is it?
I wonder
Okay.
why that's happening.
This is Gail. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to
Okay.
post something and I saw it was disabled.
Yeah, thank you. We thought it was just a few of us. All right, then let's go back to our old fashioned way and hold up your hand. I see that hand in the corner, Mr. Rock, in just a second. I want to see you.
I'll wait.
No, I know. Let everybody come up back on in their video if they want to. No, go ahead, Mike. I'm teasing you.
My question has to do with, I guess, having been disciplined by the Trump victory that came out of nowhere, and the lack of reliability of the polling and the information that we have, to ask our guests whether, for example, that Gavin Newsom won by 2 million more votes than Gray Davis had. How much, or in the recall, in terms of the recall number back there, whether, for example, were those 2 million additional votes having to do with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Did he draw 2 million people into an election who love movies and don't care about politics? And more broadly, just whether on some level, there's the potential. I mean, the other thing going on here, of course, is if somebody wins, if you don't have an Arnold Schwarzenegger, there'll be 130 candidates. I assume there'll still be a large number of them, all of whom will get 3%, and somebody who gets 7% of the vote will become our next governor. So, I mean, to what extent that there is a risk? I mean, there's always a risk, but I mean, to what extent there's a serious risk, not just that we won't pulverize the opposition here, but that we might actually lose this election based on people, the irrationality of people who seem to, want to blame the governor for the fact that their kids aren't in school, or that they're not as happy as they'd like to be otherwise because the pandemic's been difficult. And, people are grumbling, and there's a sort of a moment here of excitement. It's a long question, but I'll end it here. There's a lot of excitement going on, but ultimately there's a lot of unhappiness out there, and people feeling like the world's not going the way people would like it to go. And although Gray Davis didn't cause the energy crisis, it wasn't that hard to blame him for it. I'm sure that Newsom could be blamed for all kinds of things he had nothing to do with. And the fact that it's not rational doesn't mean that someone can't win that media battle. So that's my question to our guests.
Well, let me take a crack at answering it. In terms of the higher turnout in the recall in 2003, it is my view, having seen the polling, gone through the focus grouping, that yes, it was true that Arnold's presence brought out more voters. And just like Trump actually increased his vote from 2016 to 2020, even though he still lost pretty handily.
Right.
And you've seen a lot of the data that's been produced, which is that he brought people who never voted before in their life, infrequent voters who hadn't voted since 1994. So he did, even though he got beat badly, he did bring new voters into the process in 2020 that were not there even in 2016. And so Arnold's presence on the ballot as a world famous movie star, the Terminator, bodybuilder, Mr. Universe, whatever that, bodybuilding title that he won several times. He was a larger than life figure. There's no way around it. And his presence on the ballot motivated many voters who had not been motivated to vote in the regular election in 2002 to come out in October of 2003 and vote. And they voted against Davis, they voted to recall Davis, and they voted for Arnold Schwarzenegger. So yes, in my opinion, based upon the data that we saw in 2003, the sort of shocking increase in the number of voters between the regular election in 2002 and the recall in 2003 was motivated in large measure by the fact that you had a larger than life action figure running for governor. As people just thought it was kind of neat. The other thing is, we can never get complacent, but again, I mean, I've looked at all the polling, I've looked at at Newsom's internal polling, I've looked at the PPIC poll, I've looked at the Institute of Governmental Studies polls. There's just nothing that I see here fundamentally that suggests to me that Newsom is in trouble. And again, my advice to Democrats is don't worry about that second line. I don't care if 135,000 candidates run on the second line. The focus has to be exclusively on beating the first line and beating the recall badly. And then it doesn't matter who's running on the second line. And by the way, one of the things that I keep reminding Democrats of who are pushing for, we got to have a replacement candidate, is look what happened to Cruz Bustamante. Cruz Bustamante ran in that recall and embarrassed himself. I mean, he got beat by 19 points by Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was a sitting statewide elected official who'd been elected and reelected as lieutenant governor, the second ranking statewide elected official. And he got humiliated in the recall. Not only that, he ran his recall campaign badly. He tried to launder millions of dollars and he got hit by the biggest FPPC fine in the history of California at the time. And then he went on in 2006 and tried to run for insurance commissioner as the sitting lieutenant governor, and not only got beat, but he is the last statewide Democratic elected official to get beat in an election in California. He was running not for lieutenant governor reelection, but because he couldn't, he was term limited out, but he was running for insurance commissioner. And he gets beat by a first-time candidate, Steve Poizner, who'd never run for office before in his life. And after that defeat, and by the way, Arnold won, but there were only two Republicans who won in 2006 in the 8 statewide constitutional offices. One was Arnold beating Phil Angelides pretty badly, and the other one was Steve Poizner beating Bustamante. So if you want to look back and say, well, did Bustamante boost his political career by running in the recall? No, he actually ended it, and he went fading off into oblivion in the Central Valley with whatever the hell he's doing now. So he didn't get rewarded for his treachery. He got punished for his treachery, but it severely complicated our ability to beat the recall.
So let me just follow up and ask you, is there nobody in California who has potential name recognition, who we've not, haven't thought about necessarily being a candidate, but that has the popularity of an Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has enough money and whether it's a smart move or not, decides they're going to be an Arnold Schwarzenegger? I mean, I'm talking Hollywood, somebody, popular culture person. I'm not talking about looking to the political activists or something. I think you've made your point about them winning in this on the top line, but that who might make the same kind of shift that Schwarzenegger did. And we haven't thought about who that person is yet, but you imagine that there's no such person in Hollywood that could run and would gather that kind of support?
I don't believe
Not who's a Republican.
No, that's the
I
problem.
mean, Tom Hanks ran for governor. I don't know what would happen, but Tom Hanks is a Democrat.
Right. That's the problem. I mean, if you look at there is always the possibility that some self-important egomaniacal movie star gets into this thing. But remember one thing, okay? When people talk about Arnold, is there another Arnold? Is there going to be another Arnold? Well, by the end of his 7-year term as governor, Arnold wasn't Arnold himself. I mean, he went out of office, by the way, with job approval ratings as low as Gray Davis's were during the recall in 2003. His job approval ratings in 2010 were 22%, exactly what Davis had recorded in 2003. He did not go out as a beloved figure where everyone said, oh, he did a magnificent job. He brought an outsider's perspective to the role and he did wonderful things. No, he was viewed as basically, at the end of the day, when he went out of office, he was viewed as a bullying, blustering, bragging buffoon who was simply a caricature of his Terminator character. And so we've seen this movie before in California. Maybe in some other states they haven't. They saw it in Minnesota with Jesse Ventura, as Phil knows, right?
Yeah.
But when you elect somebody like this, no governing experience, they're used to the movie world. They turn out sometimes not to be very good at governing, and Arnold wasn't very good at governing. And by the way,
one other thought, and that is that, Mike, you mentioned something sort of in passing that I think an awful lot of people subscribe to, and that is that there was something wrong with all the polling, that the polling missed the point. The truth is, by and large, polling has been pretty good. In 2016, polling was weak in key states. Nationally, it was very accurate. But in California, we're particularly lucky in that because we have statewide voter registration, it's possible for pollsters to poll registered voters themselves, or to, at least if they do random digit dialing, which is what PPIC does, to compare with the actual voter rolls. And in a lot of states, they don't have voter registration, as Gail could explain. And so you don't have that advantage. We have a built-in advantage in California. And as a consequence, our statewide polling has tended to be enormously more accurate, going back to, the last time we really made a mistake was when George Deukmejian beat Tom Bradley. And that was because, in fact, what was happening was there was a secret ballot, mail ballot campaign by the gun owners of America, which the pollsters didn't account for. And so even though Bradley won on election day, he lost because of the secret mail ballot operation that had been going on behind the scenes.
And by the way, with respect to polling, there's not a single poll, public poll that I'm aware of that has support for the recall anywhere outside the range of 36 to 40%. 36 to 40%. That doesn't get you anywhere. And by the way, that's the Republican window in California. I mean, John Cox got, 38% of the vote. I mean, if you look, there were in the 8 statewide constitutional office campaigns in 2018, 2 of them were Democrat on Democrat runoffs, so there was no Republican, and one of them was a Democrat versus an independent, a no party preference candidate. So the other 5 had Democrats versus Republicans. And let's look at what those percentages were. John Cox received the highest share of the vote of any of the 5 Republicans, 38%. The other 4 Republican candidates, whose names probably no one on this call would even remember, received an even more embarrassing totals of, listen to this, 36.4, 35.8, 35.5, and 34.5. And Donald Trump himself only got 34.3. So
it's just the base Republican vote.
it's just base Republican vote. So what you can expect is that this recall is going to probably get 38 to 40, maybe 42%. That's the window in my view. I don't see any way in hell that they get to 50% plus 1. I think it's impossible, given the nature of the electorate and given Newsom's high job approval ratings and given the public polling we know has been done so far in the recall. So I wouldn't worry about the polling here. The key is we have to get our vote out. We have to get our vote out so we not just beat it, but we demolish the recall so it doesn't happen again anytime soon.
Thanks for that answer.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. You know what? Our tricky little system seems to be working now. So if you have a question, put it into chat. And Molly, I think we have some if you'd like to.
Andrew has a question,
Thanks.
which is a great one. I don't know if you want to ask it, Andrew, or if everybody can see it. Gary or Bill, do you want to take a stab at?
Why don't you read it out loud so everybody can,
So far,
not everybody has access to the chat.
okay. So far, the state party and Gavin's team have concentrated on raising money, gaining endorsements from local elected officials, and starting to run paid media. They're not putting much of a ground game together yet. What's our best move to maximize turnout in that context? We had close to a 90% turnout in our county in 2020.
Well,
I think the best move is to continue to attack Donald Trump.
yeah, I mean, I've been doing campaigns in California for 30 years, including 4 governor's races and 2 lieutenant governor's races. And what I will tell you is that I know there's ground game, but ground game in California, particularly in this new era where we have mail ballots, is not the same as it used to be. It's not what we Democrats were used to 30 years ago when we, sent out our precinct walkers to knock on doors and put door hangers and the whole thing. There's still some of that goes on, but that is just not the way that's just not the way you get out the vote these days. It's just not in California. And remember that, going back to ancient history, I mean, when Dianne Feinstein ran for governor in 1990, our state party chair was a guy named Jerry Brown, who you probably recall. And Phil knows this. Jerry Brown decided that he was going to turn the California Democratic Party into a Chicago-like precinct organization, right? And he spent huge amounts of money trying to make the California Democratic Party kind of like the Chicago machine. And it was a massive failure. Not only was it a huge waste of money, but it didn't work. And Dianne Feinstein got beat in 1990 for governor. And she may not say this herself, but I will tell you, knowing her people who were involved in that campaign, I mean, they blamed Jerry Brown in his attempt to try to take this, state party in this big state of California and turn it into a Chicago precinct organization. So I'm not bad-mouthing ground organization or ground operations, because we certainly had them in the Davis campaigns in both 98 and 2002, but they were a minor part of what we had to do to win those 2 elections. It just doesn't work that well in California.
By the way, if I were the Republicans and I wanted to beat Gavin Newsom, I would just pound on the French Laundry. I wouldn't even bother with anything else. I would just continue to make him look like a massive hypocrite. Yeah, I think that would be their best electoral. I don't know if it would work, but it might work. What do you think, Gary?
Well, it was a massive screw up. There's no doubt about it. And Newsom himself admitted it and apologized for it. I mean, I can't even envision what his judgment was, going up there. But I do think that, look, what saved this recall was if they had been confined to the 160 days, that is the constitutional deadline for getting signatures, this thing would have fallen flat on its face. The only thing that saved them was that 120-day extension that Republican judge, who was appointed by Arnold, by the way, and at the time he issued the ruling, was a Trump nominee for the federal bench, which tells you kind of where he's coming from, gave them a 120-day extension. And it just so happened that the beginning of that 120-day extension was when the French Laundry fiasco occurred. And I'm not convinced even today that if that French Laundry thing hadn't occurred, I'm not sure they would have gotten enough signatures even with the 120-day extension.
I don't think they would have.
So I do think that, look, I mean, these kinds of things, with politicians, it's the little things that kill you. It just is. And it was a massive screw up. And I tend to agree with you, Phil, but you know what? I don't think they have the discipline to do that, because taxes are too high and businesses are fleeing and there's homeless encampments. And, they're going to get into the whole right-wing laundry list, the same one that they posted when they filed the petition back in February for the recall itself. I don't think they have the discipline to do it.
And we have another question. How effective do you think yard signs are in terms of visibility? And I'm going to add one thing to that. What about taking signs and holding them over overpasses? Is that effective?
Well, I've used a lot of yard signs in my career over 40 years. I'm not saying I wouldn't use them again, but I think in this day and age of social media, that sort of point of contact advertising is just less effective than it was. And, I'll tell you a story about when I was living in Washington, D.C., that there was a governor of Maryland running for re-election. And, he lived in Baltimore, but obviously the state capital's in Annapolis. And so he'd get in the governor's official car, every day and go from Baltimore to Annapolis. And one day he ordered his driver to turn around and go back to his campaign headquarters in Baltimore. And he went in and he barged into his campaign manager's office and he says, "Where the hell are the yard signs?" And the campaign manager said, "Well, sir, we decided not to engage in that expense of buying lawn signs because, I mean, you're going to win this thing hands down, and your only real opponent is a bartender who filed against you." He goes, "You don't get it. I don't give a shit who sees them. I want to see them. I want to see them when I'm driving to work." Now, I tell you that story by way of suggesting that there are times you have to do things to keep candidates happy.
You know what I do think, I think it's a good question, because I think that yard signs are sort of like editorials. They're the most effective the smaller the race. That is, for a city council race, or a water board, or a local judge, or a board of supervisors race. Your Zach Friend sign in your front yard is important. But when you get to a statewide race, a national race, I think it's less important. Same thing goes with editorials and newspapers.
They are mostly name ID. They're mostly for name ID, building up name ID so people remember the name. They've seen the name. And, when you're dealing with a Gavin Newsom, who's already the governor of California, you don't need yard signs to say Gavin Newsom. I mean, people already know who he is. He's got 100% name ID. But I agree, in local races, they are, and I've done local races here in LA County. I did a county supervisorial race in 1992, and my candidate was an unknown who was mayor of a small city down in the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and totally unknown. And we papered the place. We papered that district with lawn signs because we had to have an ability to build up her name ID. But in a statewide race or in a recall race like this, I don't think they have any impact at all.
Thank you. I don't see any more chat questions. I want to ask Tricia a quick one. Tricia, you talked about the date. When will you know When will your office be told the date of the recall election?
Chances are the news will probably tell you before I find out.
True.
It's all hinging on the rest of the process. And I guess I'll step backwards. In 2018, the recall process changed a little bit. And that's what added in the supplemental withdrawal period. It added in some extended time on well, it added reimbursement and stuff. So if things go the way that it's supposed to go without anybody changing any time, on the 22nd is when the counties will finalize their numbers. The 23rd is when they're going to ask the Department of Finance, or the Secretary of State's going to tell the Department of Finance to post their estimate on how much it will cost to run the election. Then as soon as they have 30 days to post it. As soon as they post it, then the JLBC can review it for 30 days. So at the outset, you're looking at maybe in August when we would find out when the election is. But as I mentioned, the trailer bill is going to waive the JLBC's 30 days. There's questions on whether or not the $215 million estimate is the official estimate of the Department of Finance, or if that was just a preliminary. So it could be as early as the 23rd. No, it can't be. It's either going to be when the trailer bill is passed or when the Secretary of State deems it sufficient, whichever is.
Can I ask a question about this? And actually, I want to ask Gail. As the most experienced election official I know. Some Democrats are pushing to do the recall early. I think some of them are arguing that they should do it in August, and others say no, push it off to where it's a consolidated election, or at least September, October. Well, I know you'd have two different thoughts about this. One is the cost locally, but the other is in terms of strategic value. When do you think the Democrats ought to push this recall election?
Let me interrupt and have our register our voters. Let's have Tricia answer first, and then Gail can chip in. So Tricia's
Okay.
our registrar of voters. Thank you.
Well, I'll actually only answer the first part of your question because I don't want to strategize on anything that's political on when an election.
That's why I thought,
be
Gail,
called.
that's why I thought
Yeah.
I could ask you.
I will tell you that there are printers and other supply vendors that supply election materials that have publicly stated that an August election is impossible due to supply chain issues. So we have ordered our envelopes, we have ordered our ballot paper, but we will not be seeing those coming in until probably August. So to run an August election would be almost virtually impossible. So I think that the soonest we would see an election is mid-September because these vendors have publicly gone on the record and talked with the legislature and talked with the lieutenant governor's office and such on that there's not the supplies for us to run an election that would be a good experience for the voters. And I believe that overall, they want the experience to be good for the voters.
Yeah, good points. Thank you, Tricia. And let's let Gail chip in if she'd like.
Yeah, and I don't think it's so much of a timing issue as far as strategy is concerned. It's really, it comes down to us doing our work and doing it well. And, I believe all politics are local. And I think as much as voters can get information in all different means and formats, whether it's somebody knocking on their door or sending them a piece of mail or putting up a sign or talking at a coffee or an event, being on social media. I mean, just blasting the information out there in all means, all ways possible So everybody's very clear on what's happening, what the deadlines are, when the election is, when they're getting their ballot, what they need to be doing, what's the impact of voting on the first question and the second. Having that information really clear and out there is really what's most important, so whether, I mean, summer elections tend to be lower turnout because people are busy doing other things. Now that we're just reopening, all of a sudden we have a schedule now. We are doing things more, which is exciting. So I think that, having an election in September, I don't think it really matters as long as we do the job we need to do and do it well.
Thank you, Kathy.
Peggy, can I add a little perspective to this from
Sure.
the 2003 recall? What happens, I mean, remember that this year the legislature adjourns at the end of September, and then the governor has a 30-day bill signing period, which goes from September 15th to October 15th. And I've explained this to Newsom, and he understands this exquisitely. If that recall is on the other side of that bill signing period, the governor comes under excruciating pressure, even from friends, to sign bills or veto bills because of the effect it would have on the recall itself. And that happened to Davis in 2003. I mean, in 2003, Davis ended up signing bills in that 2003 signing period that he had vetoed once, in some cases even twice before, because he calculated he couldn't afford to not sign it, or he couldn't afford to not veto it because it was going to cost him support in the recall. And this is kind of an inside baseball thing, but believe me, it is very, very real. And Davis had supposedly friendly organizations like trade unions coming to him in 2003 saying, "Oh, Governor, if you veto that bill, our members are going to be totally unenthused about saving your rear end. I mean, you gotta sign that bill, or you gotta veto that bill. You just don't want a governor put under that pressure for that 30-day period," which is why we'll tell you that Newsom and the Newsom camp has kind of settled pretty strongly on getting this thing out of the way by mid-September, so that his 30-day bill signing period is not prior to the recall, because it trust me, based on what happened in 2003, it affects the way a governor starts to think about signing and vetoing bills. And that is not good for California. And frankly, it's not good for the governor either.
Yeah, and as long as that's something the local election officials can do and do successfully, great. But it also wouldn't be good for California if it's a disaster election because we don't have the poll workers, we don't have the paper, we don't have the ballots, things aren't out on time. That would be horrible too.
I agree.
So I think that we do need to listen to our local election officials and make sure the timing of this works so they can do it successfully.
I agree with that. I can't speak to that. I'm just speaking to the dynamic it has on the governor himself.
So our scanning.
Makes sense, but yeah.
Thanks, Gail. We don't have any more questions in the chat, and I'm scanning and I don't see, oh yes, I see one little hand come up. If there are no other hands, then Mike Rotkin, take it away.
I just have a quick question for Tricia. I'm just really curious, how many people during the reconsideration period changed their mind about having signed that petition in Santa Cruz County? If you know the number, you may not know it, but is it 0, 1, 10, 50, a million? I'm really curious.
So we had a single withdrawal on the petition, and that withdrawal was actually done. It was not done during the supplemental period. They turned in their withdrawal before we received their petition page.
Oh.
And so it was never reported in the first place.
So there's not a wave of people deciding they did something wrong, unfortunately.
In our county, we did not have any supplemental withdrawals. Other counties had some.
And how many people signed the petition in Santa Cruz?
Yeah.
She gave us that number.
I'll tell you in a couple seconds.
Okay.
There's a pool on this, Gail.
Yeah. Well, Tricia's looking to get the number for us. Any other questions? All right.
Well,
then
one
wait
other
for-
point I would make is that this withdrawal period that the legislature added in 2017 is kind of farcical, because the target of the recall doesn't have access to the petitions, so they don't know who signed the petitions. So how are you going to run a rational and intelligent and cost-effective campaign to get people to withdraw their names when you don't even know who the hell signed the petitions. I mean, it's farcical. I mean, good idea, but unless the target of the recall has access to those petitions and those names, there is no rational or effective or cost-efficient way to try to run a campaign during that 30 business day period to try to get people to withdraw their names, because you don't know who signed the petitions.
Yeah, so no impact. Tricia,
11,830.
Wow.
in our county.
Yes, and
Yeah.
actually there was a legislation that was introduced this session to allow the recallee, for lack of the incumbent who's being recalled, to have access to the signatures of people who signed petitions. And that bill has turned into a 2-year bill. It would have never affected this particular recall because it would have been enacted next year if passed this year. So it wouldn't have made any change. But right now, petition signatures, period, are not public record. The only time that somebody can look at them is the proponent on a failed petition that didn't meet, that didn't qualify. That's the only time anyone can look to see who signs a petition. Unless it's a nomination petition, that's a little bit different. But as far as
Yeah,
a measure, an initiative, a referendum, or a recall petition, no signatures are ever made public unless it's not sufficient, and then only to the proponent.
interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you, Tricia.
About those 11,000 folks that signed it, people need to remember that not that long ago, Santa Cruz County was, in the city of Santa Cruz, for example, one of the most conservative cities in California.
Yeah.
Okay.
And those people have not gone away. I mean, some of them passed on and so forth,
Yeah.
but they're still they're not getting anybody elected to office locally. They don't have, it's maybe 20% of the voters or something, but they're still there. They haven't all gone away. And so it's not like nobody in Santa Cruz County votes for Donald Trump or is a serious right-wing conservative. Those people, and they were very conservative. John Birch Society used to run the town. And so, we changed dramatically. We turned around and become one of the most progressive cities, at least in the state of California, but that's not always been the case. So
Yeah.
people are always shocked to find that there are conservatives here. There are.
Yep.
And they're not an insignificant number, but they just don't have the juice at this point to get someone elected, thankfully, to public office.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
I do believe that after this recall is defeated, the legislature has to take a serious attempt at looking at this whole recall procedure and tightening it up. There are only 19 states that allow recalls of governors, and California has the laxest requirements. 12% of all the voters who voted for governor in the last election. Most states that have recalls, it's 20 or 25% of the voters who voted in the last election. In addition, in order to run in the recall, you only have to put up $4,000. You don't have to collect signatures. That's why we have, these clown cars of people running. Makes a laughingstock out of California. And I think another requirement, this would be more controversial, but I think another requirement should be that there has to be a certain percentage of signatories on a valid petition that come from the target of the recall's own party. For example, if you're trying to recall a Democratic governor, 25% of those signatures have to be from Democrats. We know how many Democrats signed these petitions with 2.1 million signatures they presented. According to their own statistics, only 9% of the signatories on these petitions were Democrats. Now, do the numbers. There's 10.7 million registered Democrats in California. If 9% of those signatories are Democrats, that means about 190-some thousand Democrats signed those petitions. If you do the numbers on that, that means that 0.018% of registered Democrats in California signed those damn recall petitions. That is not a bipartisan recall. That is not a grassroots rebellion against the governor. 64% of the signatories are Republicans. And if you look at the maps, the color-coded maps of the counties where those signatures came from, it is all red California. It's the Central Valley. It's the cow counties up north, right under Oregon. So there should be a distributive requirement, in my view, particularly when it comes to recalling a governor, that a certain percentage of those signatures have to come from the party of the person that you're trying to recall. Otherwise, this is just a plaything for the minority party that has no power in the state to try to screw around with people who are validly and duly elected, as they did with Davis and as they're doing with Newsom.
That brings up another thing real quick. The ballot design is going to be really interesting if we do have another 135 candidates. My dog. In that we had it run in the old election with the old system.
Yeah.
The capacity on the the ballot and the touch screen device is going to be interesting to see how it lays out, because people will vote in every column instead of voting for one.
Yeah, no question. Yep. So far, I think we have 64 people who have indicated they're going to run.
Which will definitely put it into 2-3 columns and multiple screens on the accessible device.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And people get confused.
Yep.
Go tell Darwin to be quiet.
I think that we should make candidates for the replacement line have to go out and get their own signatures. Not an unduly high number, but if we required candidates not just to pay $4,000 that they borrowed from their father-in-law or from their bank or took out of their retirement account, but if we forced these people to go out and get, say, 7,500 valid signatures of their own, it would wipe out most of the chaff, because most of them couldn't do that. Most of them couldn't do that at all.
But
Well,
then
Gary,
you
I
need
think
more
you've had
time
the
in
last-
the process to allow for that. So that would put off the election even more.
Yeah, but that's less important to me than not having 135 clowns running for governor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the last word. We want to thank
We also
Tricia
have, we
and
hear from Molly
Phil.
though, right?
Tricia and Phil and Gary and everybody for coming out and being with us on a sunny Saturday morning. At least it's
It's a
sunny
pleasure.
here finally. Folks, the recording will be on our website in a few days, dwcscc.org.
Peggy, we also want to hear from Molly.
We're not going to have a July meeting, but we will have a program in August. And thank you. I almost did forget Molly. Molly, my colleague, you're going to share some resources for all of us.
Yeah,
And we'll put this in the website.
I think
Thanks,
we've
Mike.
touched on almost everything. So I think, yeah, we'll put everything on the website, and I think we're good. We're at 11:36, so we can
That's
wrap.
okay. If you want to, if there's something you want to post here and you think it's better in the website,
Yeah, let's wait for the website. I think there's not a lot of specifics that I can point to right now other than different websites. And I think really hearing Gary and Phil's kind of suggestions on what the best things for people to do on this call, ways we could get involved, is the most interesting. Yes, I guess Gary and Phil, do you have any final words for how people on this call, if we want to make an impact, what can we do to participate and make it a big win for Democrats?
Make sure that the voters get out to vote. We have to motivate Democrats. And ironically, the public polling showing that this recall is going to go down in flames, 57-40 in the PPIC poll, can be a demotivating factor for Democrats. Well, he's going to win anyway. I don't need to, bust my tail to get out and vote. We have to discourage that attitude from developing among Democrats, because we want to beat this not just barely, but badly. So
yeah, I think that's the takeaway message, Gary, for all of us that we got from you, right? It's not just beat it a bit, beat it badly.
badly.
Everyone's
Yeah.
getting
Phil,
I would
Phil,
say-
did you have another, excuse me,
Yeah,
yeah, just a second.
I would
Phil.
say raise money for Newsom's people to be able to do advertising, and then use social media as much as possible, because it's enormously powerful in this circumstance. If 10 of your friends are made to understand that they must vote against the recall, that has an exponential effect.
And Gail, you wanted to chip in a bit there?
I was just saying that everyone's getting a ballot mailed to them, right, Tricia? So,
Yep.
so they're
Yep,
gonna have
she
that.
told
There's
us.
so many options for voting. There's no excuse not to.
Mhm.
Right, thank you. And thank you, Tricia, for posting the votescountant.us. We know where to check for more information. So again, thank you everybody for coming. And we'll see you in August with another great program that Mike will put together. So
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you, everyone. Stay
Pleasure.
healthy.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Everybody
Pleasure,
stay
everybody.
safe. Take care.
It's a pleasure.